I mean, we try to put this into a historical context, and people are saying, well, this is worse than 2008, the financial crisis. Is it as bad or worse than the Great Depression that, of course, then led to the 1930s?
I think it is probably as bad as the Great Depression. It's very different because the origin is not a deficiency in demand. It's not a stock market crash or a financial crisis as in 2008. It's the virus. But that has both demand and supply side effects. And the real uncertainty here is whether the governments, which have put up a lot of money so far, will they be willing to sustain that support? If they don't pursue the right policies, we could, in fact, have another Great Depression.
Okay, Ngaire Woods, you've written quite a lot about the possible consequences, unpleasant consequences of this virus and the possible Great Depression, and particular nationalism. Is that something that you're scared of?
Yeah, look, I think there is a real fear, particularly since some of the governments that have done worst in managing this crisis have been the larger, wealthier, and perhaps more arrogant governments. It's some of the more humble and poor governments that knew that they had to build fences on the cliff edge very quickly before people fell off that cliff. Here in Britain, in the United States, in Brazil, you can see policymakers desperately trying to build hospitals at the bottom of cliffs. My fear is that in those governments, in those countries where governments have done badly, politicians will want to resort to nationalism. They'll want to say, this is China's fault, or this is the United States' fault, or this is the World Health Organization's fault. And they will call their own people together with some kind of nationalism and fear. But that's not necessarily what will happen. There is a different avenue, which is a positive one. Okay,
but Joseph Stiglitz, isn't that exactly what's happening in the United States right now? Because Donald Trump seems to be turning, his China message, his anti-China message, into his best hope for re-election.
That's right. But it's not a response that resonates with an awful lot of Americans. I think most Americans realize the fault is with the administration, Donald Trump. And why is the United States doing so much more poorly than New Zealand? Leadership. And that really echoes the point that was just made. Some of the small governments have done a fantastic job and show that democracies can actually work very effectively.
Okay, Ngaire Woods, go on.
Well, I think the hardest thing for democracies is actually the effects of social media. That what we're seeing is, what Joe said is true, but it's also true that 1/3 of Americans and more than 1/5 of Brits think that it's either a hoax or a conspiracy, this virus. And I think that for democratic governments, they are facing, a social media as the source of information for so many of their population, which most analysts are telling us is absolutely dominated by the most extreme voices. And those extreme voices are actually peddling a xenophobic nationalism, a conspiracy theory, and a scapegoating of others.
Ngaire Woods, do you think there's a crisis for Western democracies here? Because some of the countries that have done really well out of this, I mean, relatively well, are countries like Taiwan, South Korea, which are democracies, but they're based in Asia and have had different experiences.
No, I think there are other democracies have done just as well. Greece in Europe, New Zealand, as was already mentioned. This is not about democracies or autocracies. This is about governments having humility to accept that they've got to prepare before the crisis hits them, because otherwise they won't be able to control it, and taking the painstaking but important measures to build a public health system, track, trace, isolate. And the countries that have thought they can do without that by some magic means are the countries that are failing. Some are authoritarian and some are democratic.
Right. Joseph Stiglitz, do you think this is ultimately going to be really bad news for populist governments, or can they try and turn this somehow to their own advantage by stoking fears?
Well, I have to express some optimism. I do think that in the United States we'll turn the corner in November. The failure of the Trump administration is so apparent that, Ngaire is right. There's about 1/3 of the population, 30%, but among the rest, there's a real awareness of how bad things are, and it will motivate voter turnout. And I think that will be a critical factor in our democracy and restoring a kind of sanity to the process.
Okay, so you're an optimist. What about you, Ngaire Woods? Will something good come out of this?
Yeah, I think something can come out. I worry for the American election because I think it's going to be an election about getting people out, and it's the extremist voices that will push voters out. But positively across the world, I think the crisis is the tide that goes out and reveals who's swimming naked, and it's showing people that government is deadly serious, that it's important that not to have clowns in political leadership offices, and that when people come together and focus on a crisis, if they prepare for it, if they deal with it well, they save lives, and they also make it quicker to recover their economies and recover their jobs.
Okay, so competence is a big winner, incompetence is a big loser. What about institutions and people? Who are going to be the big winners out of this crisis? Ngaire Woods first.
So I think, again, the countries and the best actions have come from quite robust institutions in which people have bothered to invest before the crisis. You can't suddenly magic it out right in the middle. It's like trying to run a marathon with no training. You have to build institutions carefully. You have to invest in prevention beforehand. And every now and then the world needs reminding of that, because these are the first things that ideological politicians want to cut.
Joseph Stiglitz?
It would just resonate that, in the United States, we had a White House office on pandemics actually focusing on this issue, and then Trump disbanded it. We have a very good institution historically, Centers for Disease Control. It taught the Icelandic how to respond, but then under Trump, it was defunded. So we were ill-prepared. So I think what we've learned is science, expertise, institutions really do make a difference. 40 years of denigrating the public sector has had an effect. And now I hope the lesson is, the silver lining in this cloud is that we once again realize how important the government is and these institutions, expertise in science.
Okay, now a lot of debate has been around austerity, especially in the last decade after the 2008 financial crisis. If we face more austerity, Ngaire Woods, because of the kind of the crisis the economic crisis that's emerged, do you think people will put up with it?
I think it'll just be wrong on both fronts. It'll be wrong for people, and it'll be wrong for the chances of growing out of this crisis. We need governments that are not afraid of debt, but that do not hide their heads in the sand. We've got to remember, Britain came out of the Second World War with its debt was 250% of GDP, and still it managed to do a huge, audacious growth plan. That's what the world needs now. The countries that can incur debt need to incur it, and then they need to multilateralize and provide basically resources for the rest of the world to follow them. Because we can either grow out of this crisis or we can crash out of this crisis, and crashing out will be to nobody's benefit.
Joseph Stiglitz, we always kind of talk about the end of lockdown and a return to a new kind of normality and getting rid of this weird lifestyle that we're leading at the moment. Is it possible that what we're living through right now is actually a glimpse of the future? So, a greener world with less production, less growth, and a universal basic income, for those of us who can't find work?
I don't think this is in our immediate future. The fact is, we need a lot of investment. We need a lot of investment to make the green transition. We have an enormous amount of inequality, and to bring the bottom half up to a decent standard of living is going to require a lot of investment. In the United States and many places in Europe, there's been underfunding of infrastructure, lack of preparedness for crises, as we've just seen. So the fact is that we have underspent, and what we need now is to direct the spending in the right way, and that will provide the stimulus that will help us get out of this crisis.
Okay, finally, Ngaire Woods, given all that we've discussed, and we could go on forever, are you an optimist at this stage, or are you kind of burying your head under the duvet?
No, I mean, look, you cannot be a pessimist in life. You've got to be an optimist. And this crisis is providing my own institution, it's providing some communities and some countries with some opportunities to do things that they've been neglecting. And I think that's really important. Who would have thought a year ago that the Indian government could raise its aspiration to feeding all of its population. It might not be succeeding, but it's got that aspiration. Who would have thought that a British government, after so long of austerity, would suddenly magic out hundreds of billions of pounds to protect its population?
Got to leave it there. Professor Ngaire Woods, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, thanks to both of you. Thanks very much indeed.